Okay, so we're going to get started now. Thanks everyone for coming to the latest edition of the OMA Green as Health Cape and Peach joint webinar series. I'd like to start by letting everyone know that this meeting is going to be recorded, so just make sure that you're all aware of that. And there will be an interactive component to it at the end of the session from our speaker, so please keep questions in mind. We will get to them at the latter half of the presentation. So next, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I appreciate that we're all zooming in from different geographic locations. But that being said, I myself am currently situated in the city of Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I encourage everyone to reflect on the current lands that you yourself are situated on. With their long-standing, deep connection to the land, it is no surprise that the Indigenous peoples have been leaders in sounding the alarm when it comes to the climate crisis. Their diverse cultures emphasize the keeping and passing along of knowledge. We have a duty to, and will benefit greatly from, incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing while shaping climate solutions. I think that our discussion today, with its focus on how to best communicate the often very difficult topics related to the climate crisis and its solutions, pairs very well with this objective. Whether it's with your patients, colleagues, or those in your personal lives, I hope that tonight you'll walk away from this webinar with tools to engage in more productive discussions on all things climate. So I'll now pass it along to Dr. Millie Roy to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you, Max. And before I go on, I would like to invite Dr. Gilly Adler as well. If you had a few words to add, please feel free. And if not, I will carry on. Wasn't sure if you.
I'm okay with, I don't think we need too many introductions.
Very good. All right. Thank you, Gilly. Well, I'm Dr. Millie Roy. Thanks so much, Max, for the introduction. And I'm with Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment of Cape, and I'm the Ontario co-chair. Welcome to tonight's webinar. And thanks to everyone gathered here tonight, taking time out to learn more about this very important aspect of our work and daily lives as we each seek to make a difference in our own respective ways. And of course, a big thank you to Patricia Moore, our speaker. No matter our backgrounds or beliefs, we all yearn for a healthy life, a safe place to live, and a favorable future for ourselves and our loved ones. So why, even with access to information and opportunity, would anyone choose not to take action against climate? So by understanding the cognitive processes behind the barriers that might exist, healthcare professionals can more strategically communicate through them, ultimately turning climate apathy into climate action. And we will learn all about this from Patricia. Our speaker, Patricia, is known for her audience-first, evidence-based approach. Patricia has been helping organizations develop content and communication strategies for more than a decade, and we were speaking just before the webinar began, and she has worked with a number of different sectors, not just healthcare. She's driven by a passion for environmental justice, and after more than 150 hours of specialized training in climate science and social impact, she currently serves as president of the 350 Sacramento Board of Directors. She is based out of California, and she holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University, where she focused her research on environmental and health communication. So wonderful credentials, wonderful topic. We can't wait to learn from you, Patricia, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Roy, and I'm so happy to see all of you here. I'm going to try and transition to a screen share. If you'll bear with me a moment. This is always the will it work moment here. So I'm going to share it in. Okay, is this working? Can people see my my screen? Okay, good. So yes, so my background is in corporate marketing and communications. And then a few years back, I've also alongside that had a passion for environmental communication and seeing all the benefits of using communication tools in corporate marketing And seeing this not happen so much in the environmental world really inspired me to take a step back from, from industry. I went back to school at Johns Hopkins and studied intensely environmental communications. And with it being Johns Hopkins, there was a lot of health angle in all of the studies that we were working on. And then I came back into the market, and 350 Sacramento is part of 350.org, which is an international organization about climate justice. And Millie introduced me as the president of the board. I actually just turned into the executive director. So I'm a little bit frazzled. There's been a little bit sleep deprivation these last couple of weeks. But I'm very excited to talk about this and to really immerse in this. And I'm happy that you are all here to join me in that. So, better way to communicate about climate. So if you take away one takeaway from my talk today, it would be this. It would be to start with the future we want. So what do I mean by this? It's in environmental communications. Now, when I talk disparagingly about environmental communicators, I'm talking about myself up until the last few years, and I'm talking with all the love and knowing that we've been trying our best. But we tend to focus a little bit too much on the doom and gloom and not enough on the goal of what we want. And this is where corporate, I'm in California, so when I refer to corporate America, I'm talking, industry, wealthy organizations, the people who have been able to dedicate, years and billions of dollars into business and communication. They know this very well. Environmental communications, we tend to go with facts, and these facts are fearful. So we are presenting problems very, very well. What I'm trying to do and what we're trying to do here is flip that narrative to start talking about not only solutions, but what it looks like on the other side of that solution. What is it going to look like when we succeed? And when you actually take a moment to try and imagine what your life will feel like, what it'll look like, if you were to draw it or, photograph it, what would it entail? What would it look like? So starting with that vision is the main point that I want to make tonight. And then we're going to go over some, communication principles and models and different ways that we can use communication as a more effective tool to get our audience to do the actions that we want them to do. So let's start here. So we're going to go over the goals of our environmental communications. We're going to go through some common challenges, both on the side of the communicator and on the side of the audience. And then we're going to go through my favorite part, the communication principles, sort of the geeky, nerdy part, that it propels the real world application of this. I'm going to weave examples throughout the different parts of this presentation. So hopefully there's time at the end I can really dive into a couple examples that encompasses all of the principles. But rest assured that we will get through examples with each of the topics I'm bringing up. And then at the end, we'll have some discussion and any questions. I'm excited to talk about the aspects of this that are most interesting to you all. Starting with the goals. So as I said, starting with the end game is something that's very unusual in environmental communication and very important. So I'm going to start with a narrative about pollution that is very common in environmental communication. So this is how we have been doing it. We might tell the story that starts with the perpetrator, who's doing it and why. Oil and gas profiteers, people profiting off of fossil fuels, are continuing to pollute our air and waters and land. This is leading to illness and it's damaging our environment. We need to reduce emissions. We do this through clean energy systems, and this will clean the air and ultimately result in healthy people and environment. So that's the status quo sort of way of approaching the pollution narrative. What I'm suggesting and what most of the research that's coming out is saying that is more effective of getting people involved in solutions is turning the movement turning the narrative into the end game. So this is not a narrative about pollution, it's a narrative about healthy people and the environment. So it's the same story, but we're approaching it with, we all want to be healthy, we all want a healthy climate and healthy environment, and we want to be breathing clean air. But today, oil and gas industry profiteers have been pushing the use of fossil fuels, creating pollution, leading to illness and environmental damage. We need to reduce emission, and how do we do this? One way to do that is clean energy systems, which will clean the air and give us healthy people and environment. So that's just an example of, it's the same story, almost the same order, but it's a lot different when it's a narrative about the world we want than being a narrative about, you know, the problems in the world. So I'm not sure if you can hear this. My dog is crying in the background. She's wanting to join us. So if you hear squeaking, she's okay. She's more than okay. She's very comfortable. So, couple of challenges. Let's start with why everybody here is such an important role in communicating about climate and obviously communicating about the health implications of climate change. So a report recently came out in the Canadian Medical Association that proves what we all know, which is you are all the most trusted news source for health information. So when people are doing their own research and looking things up online and seeing things on the news and reading, articles, what they hear from their doctors, their nurses, their care team, what they're hearing from you, they're going to trust that the most. So that puts you in a really good position to be helping create the changes that we want to see. World Health Organization, after I had put this presentation together, I saw they just put out a publication for people in the health profession that is basically a toolkit for ways that you can use communication to help solve climate change and health-related problems. So the report says, as a health professional, your voice matters. Use it to make a difference and protect people's health from climate change. So your challenge is simple. All you have to do is save the planet. So did they tell you that when you went to medical school? It's a lot to ask of a single person and even a single industry. So a lot of the response to that is, yeah, we'd love to. However, it's hard to find the time, the resources. You don't always have support from leadership. There's not always public support or public interest that we're aware of. It might not be in everybody's curriculum as you're learning. And the engagement is minimal because you're too busy, saving lives and healing people. So that's been the focus. And the strategic communication part has been largely absent in, I'm not saying every place, I'm sure there are exceptions, but generally speaking, this is what health professionals are saying makes it difficult to address climate change while also doing the job of, healing and taking care of patients. So other problems that they bring up are other challenges and obstacles. The scope of the problem is too big. There's a lot of burnout already. You might get pushback from either patients or coworkers or just in general, the pressure to, keep it medical, don't, go out of your lane into the climate. There's uncertainty about how to approach this. It's a complex issue. It's been politicized, unfortunately, and that makes it extra challenging, especially, I would say, especially in the United States, but it's possible that that Canada is picking up some of our bad habits as well of politicizing some of this stuff that is really, it's a human interest story and it's about our planet. And obviously competing demands, trying to do all the things and save patients and save the planet. It's a lot. So I do have a little bit of good news for you all. One thing that we may have been focusing on for about 30 years now that we don't need to focus on anymore so much is climate change denial. And this is the environmental justice movement is taking a while to realize this, that we don't really need to convince people, most people, that climate change is real, that it's happening, that it's bad. There are nuances in there of people may not believe that, humans have control over it. But consistently, survey after survey, study after study finds that only about 10% of the population is firmly denying climate change. And even in there, the reasonings are diverse enough that it's not necessarily something we need to have as the forefront of our efforts. Our job is to present the information, to answer questions, to be helpful. But if somebody at this point is digging their heels in the sand and refusing to listen, that might not be the best use of our energy to try and prove to them that it's happening, because clearly it's happening. We have the science. Most of us in the world have this experience by now. So one thing you don't need to worry about as much is firm denial. It's more going to be about if your audience consists of individuals like patients or community groups that you're talking to. The challenges you're most commonly going to come across are access to resources and information, too much misinformation, conflicting priorities. People have to have their jobs and their families and their lives, and also trying to take care of their health. And now they're supposed to worry about pollution. It can be really challenging for them. It doesn't mean that they're denying it. It just means that hasn't been a priority. And then just our human tendency to avoid pain. Climate change at its core is a painful topic. It's painful to feel like you don't have control over it. The problem is so big. So our response tends to be, or is frequently, inaction. So these are the challenges you're going to be speaking through in your communication, not so much trying to convince the person that climate change is happening and that it's bad. There is education that you can do and how it affects people's health, and I think and that's going to be an important part of your communicating. So your other audiences could include institutions, if you're talking at universities, if you're talking to the hospital staff, and systems like politicians, lawmakers, people making the decisions about how your town is going to be run, what kind of transportation you have. So here you're up against, obviously, there's going to be political implications, competing priorities, industry pressures, and again, resource limitations. So once again, it's not necessarily about going to your audience and saying, let's talk about how climate change is happening, what's happening, why it's bad. It's more going to be, we're talking about, we all want our communities to be healthy. We all want our planet to be healthy, and we want our air to be clean. So here is what's happening, especially in the context of health, as you're communicating about it, and here's what we can do to solve it. And then you give some concrete examples, which is another important piece of the puzzle. So we're going to I forgot to set my timer here. So make sure I have enough time to talk about my favorite part, which is the communication principles. So I'm going to sort of touch on a few different communication theories, and it's sort of, every communication process that you go through is not necessarily going to pull from each and every one of these. These are just examples of things to have sort of in the back of your mind when you're deciding how to have that conversation, when you're executing the conversation. And when I say conversation, it's, it could be a one-on-one thing, or it could be you speaking to, an entire body of policymakers. So we all know this, that our audience is going to be mostly humans. And as humans, we tend to be emotion-driven. Even those of us who like to think we're driven by facts and statistics and thought and science, there's always an emotional, almost always an emotional component. We're a social creature. We are wired to respond to stories just as much, if not more, than responding to facts. Most of us tend to be uncomfortable with dissonance. So if what we want or what we feel in one regard is not congruent with something we're being told, say from our doctor or from our nurse, we're going to have to resolve that dissonance to be able to go about our day. And unfortunately, people have different coping mechanisms, and they're not always the healthiest to resolve that dissonance. And we're contextual. When you're talking to an audience, always remember that the message that's coming out of our mouths is being filtered through everybody's individual set of experiences and thoughts and feelings and memories and the way they perceive the world. So our message is always going to be changed by the time it gets to the recipient, based on the context that they're living in. And that we're mentally efficient, just as we know that we're exposed to so much information. Our brains are brilliant at picking what we're supposed to pay attention to and what we can forget. So these are some just important things that you all know. That's part of your profession in healthcare. So just to remember when we're talking about climate change, even if we're talking to policymakers or administrative staff, like these are all individuals still who share these qualities with all of us. So a few communication theories and practices that are vital in the environmental communication movement. And I'll refer to movement. That's kind of my go-to term. What I mean is it's across different industries. It's environmental specifically, but also applicable in health and any other situation where a group of people are working together to find a communication strategy to achieve their goals. So I call it the pie model of communication. It includes persuasion, inoculation, and ecological systems. So we'll go through each of those in examples. So persuasion is helpful for motivating and mobilizing people. Inoculation is good for raising awareness, especially about misinformation and protecting people from misinformation. And then the ecological systems are important to use in your approach to create action and change. And the environmental communication movement has been very good at raising awareness and trying to motivate people to convince them that climate change is real and climate change is bad and that we need to do something. I'm asserting that we're beyond that and that now we need to focus on mobilization. We need to focus on protecting people from misinformation and action and change, the goals that we want. So persuasion. So social proof is one of the biggest components of persuasion. As a social being, we are wired to want to do what the people who we think are like us are doing. And this is why if you show up to a backyard barbecue in a formal dress because you're expecting a cocktail party, you might feel kind of uncomfortable and out of place. You want to be dressed sort of like your friends and family who are also at the barbecue. So again, just a kind of a silly example, but just to show the nature of how we are persuaded by seeing what others are doing, we want to do. It's not necessarily peer pressure, it's survival. It's fitting into our environment. So it's also why people follow, a component of why people might follow fad diets. If a couple of friends are on a juice cleanse or on a keto diet, that is social proof that this is a good thing to be doing. Whether or not the person believes that this is actually scientifically going to improve their lives, everybody else is doing it. It looks like fun. I want to try too. Social proof is also part of the environmental movement. Very rarely does an individual decide to go out into nature and start planting trees by themselves. You usually do that because there's an organized group of people going out to plant trees. The same concept with mask wearing, which we've all had the experience in these last few years of seeing, when more people around you are wearing masks, you feel more comfortable wearing your own mask. Now, because in healthcare, it's, I'm sure, different. You are used to wearing masks a lot more in a lot higher percentage of your life. I'm talking more out in public, out and about, in group settings. Usually there's at least in California, I find that I'm either the only one wearing a mask and I feel kind of uncomfortable, or I'll see 6 other people, in a room full of 20 people, and with me being one of, 7 people wearing a mask, I feel a lot more comfortable in it. So social proof is huge. When you're talking to patients, when you're talking to people who you're trying to impact their behavior, if you bring into the story, I've had other patients who have experienced a very similar thing, and this is what they did. And they've reported that it was really helpful. It made them feel better. Or even if you're comfortable sharing your own experience and you're talking to a patient, I even tried this myself. And I found it made a real difference. I was able to breathe easier once I started, opening the window when I had my gas stove on. So again, social proof. Framing is another really important component of persuasion. There is a famous, at least in this area, because I'm not too far from UC Berkeley, Dr. George Lakoff wrote the famous book, Don't Think of an Elephant. His whole premise is about the importance of framing, and the point being, if you tell somebody not to think of an elephant, what is the first thing they're going to be thinking of is elephant. So when we're telling people not to do something, don't eat a donut, they are now picturing, and there's now a framework in their brain of a donut. And if that's, if they're suggestible like I am, that's going to make them want to, go out on a Sunday and get a donut. And whether or not that's a good or bad thing is, up to the individual and their medical professional, but it's just framing is important, and it sets a stage. So in environmental communication, when you approach it to tell people the world is on fire, it's burning down, the air is ruined, climate change is going to destroy us all if we don't change. Okay, that may be true. Hopefully not, but that's not going to be most likely to get the person to change their behavior. If instead we talk about that our planet is beautiful and that it has been stable for thousands of years and we're adapted to it, and it's, we have been living in harmony for most of the 200,000 years of human existence, and that's something that we want to maintain for the next 200,000 years, or for the rest of your life, for the rest of your kids' life. Talking about the beauty of the planet as opposed to talking about the burning of the planet is a huge important frame that you can approach communications through. Another sort of side area of framing is individual agency, which is different than individual responsibility. Growing up in California in the 90s, there was the reduce, reuse, recycle. And that was huge. And, all of our institutions, all of our public spaces had recycle bins. And this was to put the onus on the individual to solve climate change, with the sort of underlying message that it's the individual's fault of climate change. We don't want to do that anymore. It is the fault of large profit-motivated industries and the individuals profiting from it. So the individual's role is not to feel bad about climate change. The individual's role is to understand, this is what I can do to protect myself and my family and my community. And the more of us that do that, the more effective we're going to be together. So again, just respecting or putting the person's personal agency in the solution is really, really helpful. So I'm going to speed up because we have just a few more minutes. Inoculation is a communication theory pulled straight out of your industry, and it's exactly as it sounds. It is giving somebody a sort of dose of misinformation in order to protect them from being victimized by misinformation. And there are 3 steps in inoculation theory. The first is warning the person. So when you tell them a fact, let's use in the United States, gas stoves has been a big topic of conversation because there's been a lot of misinformation. So to warn somebody, we're going to talk about how to make the air in your home cleaner while you're cooking, how you can protect yourself and your loved ones from breathing in fumes through, simple things like turning on a fan and cracking a window. However, somebody may approach you and tell you, and then you give them an example of the counter argument. They might tell you that we're trying to steal or take away your stove. We're trying to make it so you're not allowed to cook. Well, that's, so you're telling the person, expect some misinformation, expect somebody to try to manipulate you. This is what they might be saying. And the third step, which a lot of people forget in the inoculation conversation, is to then have the person who you're talking to participate in this hypothetical conversation. So we've warned them about misinformation. We've told them that somebody might say that that we're trying to take away your stoves. So then you ask them, so what would you say if somebody came to you with that statement? Well, then the person can turn to you and say, well, I'll tell them, nobody's trying to take my stove. So just having the person participate in the conversation, they have now invested in the truth that you're talking about, and it protects them even more against, the inevitable messages that they will be exposed to out in the world that are trying to convince them otherwise. So another important part of inoculation in communication is media literacy, and this is beyond probably the scope of most healthcare professionals, but media literacy, the one definition is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. So in your context, this might be reading articles about scientific studies, helping people understand that the big headline that they see might not actually be what happened or what was discovered in a certain study, and helping them figure out how to avoid being swayed by a sensational headline. So helping people develop sort of that protection against not just misinformation, but sort of sensationalized, simplified information as well. The third part of the pie communication is ecological systems, and this is a group of communication theories that it's kind of in depth. There's a lot of words here on the screen, so don't worry about reading each and every one. These are just examples of, they come in different shapes and sizes, but they all have in common that when you're communicating with an individual, there are other layers, other spheres of influence that are going to be in that person's life. So if you're telling somebody, about how to protect their lungs from high pollution, then you also have to know that they also have families that are having demands from them. They also have a community that is set up a certain way that may or may not, involve having a chemical plant nearby that is polluting the air that they have no control over. That, institutions, political systems. I really like in Frieden's health impact pyramid, there's a very specific part that I believe is really important, and that's changing the context to make the behavior we want the default behavior. So that's, it's kind of getting a little bit into the weeds here, but just keeping in mind that, systems impact individuals impact systems, that we're never just talking to a person as sort of an isolated set of communications. So nudge theory is from more the corporate communication world, but it works in environmental communication too. It works in health communication, which is, changing your environment. And people can do this for themselves. I do this with making sure that I have my fruit and veggies just easy to get to in the kitchen. So when I'm hungry and need a snack, I go for that. And I hide the stuff that might not be as good for me, back, and make it inconvenient to get to. So I'm actually setting up a nudge in my system, in my environment, to make the choices that I want to make easier to make, the default choices. So let's look and see what we have. A few minutes left. We can go over a couple of examples here that kind of ties this together. So this example is going to be, we're talking to a patient. Maybe the patient is a child, and so you're talking to that child and their parent. We want to start with, and let's say this child has asthma, and maybe lives in an area with, a high level of pollution. So you're going to talk to them about having a healthy, active child. The child's going to want that. The mother's going to want that. And how important it is to have cleaner air so that we can breathe better. And so the child is less prone to asthma attacks, and hopefully, less prone to asthma in general. But today, the oil and gas industry is trying very hard to perpetuate fossil fuels, and they're making it very hard for people to replace their gas stoves because it's expensive. They're making it hard to replace, to buy a electric vehicle is not as easy as we'd like it to be. So what we're doing in this part of the conversation is telling them it's not your fault that your child has asthma. It's not your fault that when you cook dinner, your apartment is filling up with fumes. There is a perpetrator here, and it's not you, it's not the child, obviously. There's, and then you explain how the relationship between environmental pollutants and, say, for example, asthma. And what we need to do is we need to reduce the exposure, because a lot of people can't just move. They can't just replace their car. They can't replace the factory next door. They can't replace their gas stove. So what you can do is tell them things that they can do. So they do have the agency to take steps to clean the air in their home. Something as simple as an air filter, cracking a window, as we talked about, having pamphlets and flyers and a website and things that gives them, steps and information about that, so that they can get from different angles, different forms of communication to help them know what kinds of actions they can take and why they're at risk. And they're at risk is not because of their life, it is because of their setting. So you're helping them find a way to be healthier and happier and more active in the setting that we live in today. So I think we're getting a little bit close. We might go through one more example. Same kind of topic, but now we're talking to a health, say a hospital or institution. We're talking to the hospital administrative staff. We all want to have a community with healthy, active children, with clean air, where we can breathe easy, and we won't be spending as much money on healthcare costs because people are getting sick from breathing bad air. Then we go through the story, the perpetrator, the motive, the cause, the environmental damage, the harm. And then this is what we need to do. We need to reduce exposure, and we need to increase access to resources. So what I'm asking from you, hospital administration staff, is can we invest in more resources for our patient? Informational resources, maybe even setting up areas where they can get sort of little cooking stoves that are electric instead of gas, some training to help other doctors and nurses learn about what they can do to help their patients deal with air pollution. So again, you're still starting with, we want a community of healthy children with clean air, with easy breathing. And then we go through the steps. You don't have to convince the hospital administrators that climate change is bad and that it's harming people's health. You might explain how that's happening and why that's happening and how we can fix it. And we're going for the outcome of healthy people, healthy planet. So same thing for policymakers. I'll kind of fast forward through this. Again, that you're still talking to individual people and groups of people. Their motivations might be a little bit different. With policymakers, they are also considering, well, what will get me reelected, or what will threaten my ability to get reelected. So taking that into consideration in your messaging. So again, if you take away one thing from my long, quick babbling speech about communication and healthcare and environment, it is to start and end with the world we want. And all the middle stuff, all the different communication principles that we bring in, the framing, the social proof, the taking into account ecological systems, the inoculation, all of that is sort of the why and the how and the what to get to the place we want. So now, without further ado, I would be happy to take any questions, or if anybody has anything they want to add, I would love to hear that. And I will, let's see, and stop sharing so I can see all your faces.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patricia. That was fantastic. I really appreciate that take-home message. I think it's such a powerful tool to focus on something positive, and I think it's a trap that I myself certainly can get bogged down on when communicating with friends or other people about climate change, is focusing on that negative. And I think that's a really important and great takeaway. So thank you so much for taking us through that. I'm going to help facilitate the Q&A a little bit. So once again, I'll invite anyone if they'd like to sort of speak directly. You feel free to sort of use the Zoom function to raise your hand or unmute, and we'll ask you to ask your question that way. Or if you prefer, as I see a few people have done, you can use the Zoom chat, and I can read that out for you. We did have a few questions submitted in advance during the registration, and I'd like to start with this one. I think it's something that you touched on with the examples focusing on the patient communication, but I think that it's a good one to revisit in general terms. So someone previously asked, how can physicians more effectively communicate to patients the links between climate change and the patient's health problems?
Yes, that's a great question. And everybody here is perfectly situated to enact this part of the communication. And so this is probably one of the most important takeaways here. Again, to remember that is you don't have to necessarily convince them about climate change being bad. You probably don't have to convince them about the threats to their health in terms of how they're feeling and what their experience is. So as the person who asked the question emphasized, it's about communicating that link. And I think one thing we need to be careful of is not to begin this conversation in a way that sort of raises the person's defenses. And that is where starting with the end, starting with I want you to be healthy. I know you want to feel healthy. So let's see what we can do. So if we're talking about, again, I'm going to these same examples, because if I fill it up with too many examples, I'm going to be getting into what your expertise is. And so I want to keep talking about communication, not necessarily medical part. So if we're talking about pollution and asthma, and I'm going to take one step aside and just explain why I'm using the word pollution. Another thing that happens in our industries is we get used to saying carbon dioxide, we get used to saying greenhouse gas emissions, GHGs, and that is language that we all understand and we all respond to, but the vast majority of people are more likely to understand a word like pollution. So using the language that is most accessible to the most people, if you're talking about pollution and asthma, for example, starting with the reason for the pollution. Another thing to remember is that climate change is not the problem. Climate change is not what is doing this to all of us. Climate change is an effect of what somebody is doing. And that somebody, as we talked about, is the people profiting off of oil and gas and other harmful industries that they themselves recognize is terrible for the planet and the people, but it's too lucrative to stop. So when you're introducing this linkage between environmental pollutants and, for example, asthma, bringing in that, I'm just calling them the perpetrator. They have they're setting this up to make it very hard for us to have access to clean air. So what can we do? You have your medical expertise in terms of what you're going to talk about, the airways and what it does to the lungs and, the effects of, fresh air and breathing versus pollution and breathing. But as you do that link, you're defining who's doing it, why they're doing it, and what's happening, and then what can you do about it? And then you're setting it up like we're on the same side here. We are defending ourselves against this thing that somebody's doing to us. And these are a few things we can do. And again, making sure that if you don't have the actual resources that the person needs, try to have enough of your network, enough of your written materials that you can point them in the right direction. So the person leaves this conversation feeling empowered to do the things that they need to do for their health. They don't have to feel bad about the problem because it's not their fault. They can feel good about the steps that they can take and that you're on their team. So that would be an important part of the linking, besides just the scientific explanation that you all are so good at, is keeping in mind that it's not their fault that they're breathing, and it's not the climate's fault. The earth, is going to do what Earth's going to do. We need to protect it so that we can live in it. Yes, Dr. Nevo?
I raised my hand, but I don't know, Max, if you want to take more questions from the people who asked prior to the webinar or from the chat.
No, you can go and
happy to-
I'll continue with more after you.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to bring it down to very pragmatic questions. I see two scenarios that I think we all grapple with, that I think I grapple with every day. So one is a patient in our clinic. Do I have the right to start talking about climate change? And I don't want to be preachy. So, the connection, but, I have a client who's has a problem, and how do I, first, do I connect it? Is it my role? Do I have permission to do it? And two, how do I connect it without being preachy? So that's one scenario. The other scenario is politicians. So you're saying that it's political in California, it's political all over the world. It's clear that if all countries were liberal and not conservative, then we would have been in a different place right now. So do we have permission? And again, how do we communicate to politicians who actually, you said that there's no longer climate change denial, but I think there's a lot of denial in the fact that it's man-made, right? A lot of people, even physicians within the OMA, say that it's just a natural course of things. And the problem is the man-made piece, not if it's happening or not. So those are my main two questions.
Okay, so one answer that is, I think, applicable in both places. Oops, okay, your little picture moved, so I found you again. Is that yes, you do have permission. This is a health issue, and you are the health experts. So anybody and any politician or any political group that has made you feel that this is outside your lane, I don't usually speak in absolutes, but I will here, they're wrong. This is absolutely your lane, because this is harming the people that you have dedicated your lives to healing and protecting. So, and I think to your first question about without being preachy, people, again, going back to people trust you. They trust their healthcare team. And so it's better for them to hear it from you than any place else they're going to hear it from, because you can't trust we can't necessarily trust whatever article headline, and when I say article I mean like news headline that they're going to read about it. They might not get the information. So it's not preachy. People expect to hear the truth about how they can take care of their health from their medical professionals. So there has been a concerted effort to make people feel, again, I think this is part of the politicalization, is to make us feel like, oh, this is outside our lane. No, this is absolutely your lane. And the way to reduce the preachiness of that, and part of that is you don't want the person to be defensive, because who are you to tell me that my home is bad for me? And that's where sort of just being careful of, and the missing piece of most of this conversation commonly is the source. And the source isn't this nebulous thing. It is somebody's doing this to you, and I'm on your team. So, let's solve this together. What are some things we can do? And then, then the person will see you as their advocate, which you are. And you are starting out the gate by letting them know this isn't your fault. But thankfully there are some things you can do. You do have some solutions that you can take. So your second question about politicians. So that's that's a big issue, and that's what my organization 350.org does on a small scale. We tend to do it for the city of Sacramento and the county of Sacramento, but we do go to the state because we're located in the state capital. And yes, you are absolutely right. There are some people who deny about the anthropomorphic component of climate change. I'm going to talk just from my personal opinion. I might suspect that in the politicians who are putting this forth might not be 100% genuine in that, in how they're portraying their beliefs. It's helpful for them to say that for a lot of different reasons. And we can't, even as physicians, even as much as you can help, I don't want to use a disparaging thing. So you can't fix corruption. And it would be very hard. It's as hard to fix climate change outright denial as it is to change flat earthism. if we present more facts, we think they'll change their mind. In some cases, yes, but as limited energy, personal energy, limited time, limited resources, you're better off sort of having a collective response to the health connection with climate change. And that's, all of you here, the organizations that you're affiliated with, repeating the same message. And that is this link between climate change and health. And when you're talking to politicians, definitely call out the perpetrator, but because they're the ones that control the resources, I think focusing on the resources and focusing on why it's important and what world you want, what communities you want is going to be your best bet. So unfortunately, I don't have the magic wand to fix the ultra right sort of, the political rights assault on truth. I think we're better positioned here to protect people, inoculate them against that assault on the truth. And when you're speaking to politicians, it's generally in a public forum. So you're, especially if there's more than just one of you talking about this, you're giving social proof to the solution. And it kind of puts that politician on the spot when, people are watching and they're paying attention, or some people are watching, some people are paying attention. Hopefully more will over time. But so I don't have the full answer for you. If I wish I could solve this, still working on it, but I think just continuing to try, we're not giving up. When I talk about not addressing denialism, I don't mean give up. I just mean allocating your resources. Talk to the politicians who might actually do something to make a difference. If you know that this person is going to just outright deny and slam the door in your face and disparage you, well, maybe you don't want to spend your, Thursday afternoon trying to talk to that person.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I think that did a great job sort of addressing some of the questions we had in the chat, regarding misinformation from political leaders. And I'll just try to combine two of the questions we have in the chat for you now, and then Christine, if it's okay, we'll get to you next. Thanks for raising your hand. So sort of regarding that last question that you spoke about, this misinformation that might be not so genuine coming from politicians. How about sort of pivoting that, and this is from two of our physicians in the chat here, how about pivoting that issue, but rather when physicians are facing that from patients that are coming in with misinformation. So I see Renee Turcott shared some great examples of, how do we convince someone that oil and gas is bad when they're sort of telling you facts about cement and windmills having significant carbon, footprints, and the rare metal mines to make electric cars and the environmental issues associated with that, chemicals to dismantle these electric cars. So I think these are, common things that I've encountered myself as well. And I think that patients might bring to the table. So to frame that into a bit more of a narrow question is, how, again, and circling back to your talk, how do we address that misinformation when it comes and hits us directly in the face in clinic from our patients?
Yes, that's a great question. And yes, when I was talking about inoculation theory, it works, much better when it's before the person is assaulted with the misinformation. So once the person has already been exposed to it, and worse yet, has bought into it, your job is a lot harder. But it's still, I think, if you haven't tried this yet, I highly recommend adding the perpetrator and the motive. And I know those are words that sound kind of strong, but it is strong. There is a small group of people perpetuating and worsening this problem. And we like to talk about the facts. We like to talk about what solutions. But by keeping that out, by people not really understanding that there is a concerted effort to manipulate you, to manipulate me, to manipulate all of us, or to get us to avoid or ignore it. Leaving that out of the conversation, I think, has done us all a disservice, because then what we're leaving the problem is this nebulous thing of this climate change thing. The climate's doing this to you. No, it's not. A person is. So when the person's been exposed, oh, I saw it in the news, I did my own research, letting them know that, good that you're doing your own research, because, we like to encourage people to find the facts. One thing you might want, this is me talking to your patient, as you're learning more about this, look out for these warning signs and kind of try and see, let's take a step back further and see who is behind this information. And then you as a physician with your expertise can sort of guide them, kind of frame it. It's, whether we're talking about pollution, we're talking about oil and gas industry, possibly, factory farming, all the auto industry, the industries that have a few wealthy people at the top and a few corrupt politicians. It's time to call them out. I know that sounds very activisty, and that sounds kind of not necessarily what we're used to doing as medical professionals and communicators, but it might be time to do that. So the person doesn't have to be defensive that they're being accused of doing something wrong in a problem they did not create. And they're so very difficult. I do empathize with you when you have a patient who has already been exposed to and bought into that misinformation. That makes your job a lot harder. So adding that, sort of giving them a little bit of media literacy, have some literature there for them about, so if you have literature about media literacy, that's a lot of alliteration. So you can send them home and it sort of help them learn how to decipher truth from untruth. And also to let, frame it as, people who are being told this, they're actually being victims of a massive movement to convince all of us that something isn't real when it's real. So we're all impacted by this. We get social proof.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think that's a great framework. Yeah, I see thumbs up from Renee, so that's good. Okay, I'll ask now, Christine, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia. That was really helpful. I'm hoping we're going to get the slides because they were great. So I'm giving a TED Talk in 6 weeks in Oshawa, and it's the intersection of the climate emergency and mental health. And my argument is that a lot of it has been a collective dissociation. Like, people are so scared that they've kind of checked out. And then industry is like denying to the point that like all the evidence is there, it's dissociative. And one of the statements that I'm struggling to get out of my mouth because I don't even know how to think of it is like, leaders in politics and business don't hate their children. So like, I'm struggling with that psychology, like, because yeah, I'm blaming the perpetrator, but like, how are they that dissociated? And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on it, because I don't really know how to get that phrase out of my mouth and mean it, because like part of me wonders if they do.
So that's a great question. And between you and me and all of us on this call, there is a degree of sociopathy that is disproportionately represented in the business executives of these very harmful corporations and industries. So you might not be ready to go out and do a TED Talk and accuse an individual of being a sociopath, but that is like for our own just sort of understanding to just know that no, they don't hate their children, but they're not prioritizing them. And again, this is a very small set of people with an outsized amount of power. So most of the time, if it's not a sociopath, it's just somebody who has been misled and who has, embraced a narrative so much that they can't let go of it. They do love their kid, and starting with that shared value, starting with, we all want our children to be healthy. I know you want your children to be healthy. I want that for my family. We all want that for our communities. And then going through the narrative as you do. So acknowledging again, you're sort of preemptively getting rid of the need for them to get defensive, so that they don't think that you're accusing them of not caring about their kids.
Thank you. Super helpful. It's also a helpful thing to just be living in Calgary, because I have friends who work in oil and gas. It's hard to navigate. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So just to follow up on that, then I did not mean to accuse your friends of being, the people in that industry. They are people like you and me with jobs. So when I'm talking about that, I mean, unless you associate with billionaire, oligarchs who, and at least in our country, we have billionaire oligarchs who are sort of manipulating the scene. I'm not talking about the people who work there. They love their kids too.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. Elaine, I believe you're next, if you'd like to unmute.
Hi there. Patricia, your slides are fantastic and your talk was really super interesting and useful. I was just thinking about the things that Renee said there, and think about how in many lies there are grains of truth, right? It is true, for example, that rare earth metals are largely mined in places with much less rigorous environmental regulation than we might have in Canada or the US, which is precisely why they're not mined here. And oftentimes there are issues with social justice involved in that, and child labor and so on. It is also true that cement and steel are huge components of greenhouse gas emissions and other forms of pollution. So it always seems to me like almost everything we do is fraught, really. It's hard to do anything on this in this world that we live in that doesn't have a consequence of some sort. I was giving a talk, a planetary health session to the medical school class at NOSM, and I was talking about electrification of transportation and so on. And at the end, one of the medical students put up their hand and said, you know, when I think of electric cars, I don't think of saving the world from climate change. I think of child labor in the Congo. And, you know, like it's true, right? This is the problem is that even in these things that people are trying to use as arguments against some of the green technology, for example, there are elements of truth, right? And we need to bear that in mind. I don't really know that I have a question exactly. It's really more just a comment.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I'm glad you brought that up because yeah, it's on one hand, we want to emphasize incremental change. On the other hand, we need a lot of change right now. And the idea of completely renovating all of our industries to make them perfectly, you know, respectful of our planet and our people and human rights it's a very big charge that we're putting forth to our brethren, our other human beings, like change everything, that's all. So yeah, so I think just acknowledging that, yeah, that is true. And that's why electric vehicles are only part of the solution, and that in and of itself needs to be solved. So we can only, you know, as individuals and even as groups of individuals, I think picking our battles, as you say, or as, you know, we have a lot of violent metaphors in the United States. So, but picking where you want to spend your energy and where you can and where you're best suited to spend your energy, acknowledging like, yes, this is also problematic and beyond problematic. It's, you know, that's a really good point. You know, child labor, human rights abuse, this is all stuff that's part of environmental justice and it all needs to change. Which is why when we talk about these as solutions, we're only talking about this as part of the solution. And there are people who are also working on that. If you want to be the person who's working on that, then you're honing your message down and taking this to be the goal. Your goal is now to make it so that people can have transportation options that don't hurt people at any stage of development. If that's not, if you're taking a step back and doing it more sort of global health, people health and planetary health, it's acknowledging we do need electric transportation, we do need public transportation, and in that, you know, among all the other changes we need to make, in that we need to dig down and make sure that we're accountable for how these things are being built. Another thing in terms of inoculation is that is an intentional narrative that has been out there. Now, again, like you said, it's true, which makes it so powerful. But the narrative of this is not a good solution, so we shouldn't, you know, it's not a perfect solution, so we shouldn't do it. That has widespread implications, and that wasn't also done intentionally. So it makes me sound like a wild conspiracy theorist, but when you look at the history of propaganda, when you look at the history of specifically different industries, how they have used propaganda to just ingrain messages into our culture and our societies, being able to see that sort of from an outside perspective and telling your patients, this is how you be on the lookout for that. We all have these in our minds, and we didn't get them out of thin air. We got them for a reason. Somebody gave us that message.
Yeah, certainly a challenging topic. So I appreciate the response and some of the clarifications. I see Gilly's got your hand up, so if you want to go ahead.
So I think we need to end. I don't want to elongate it too much. I just had to respond to Christine's question and your answer to Christine, because this is a topic that bothers me a lot, which is, in my mind, if conservative governments around the world would have embraced climate change, that one thing would have changed the world. And as mental health providers, as objective, scientific profession that people trust, do we need to believe that they are so cynical and sociopathic? I actually do not believe that. And I'm looking for a thread, for a way. I really do believe that we live in bubbles, and that as a community, as a society, they do not believe that it's as scary and as dangerous as I think all the people here believe, because that's why we're here. And that's the thread I'm looking for. So I don't know if we'll answer it tonight, but I don't want to leave us with thinking that the conservatives are the enemy and we can't talk to them and they're, all corrupted psychopaths. I really don't believe that. So I want to stay with all of us here brainstorming if we could somehow find that thread to get there and speak with them, because I think that would change the world.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up, because yes, I did not mean to imply that everybody who is participating in this policy is, uncaring. And in fact, if somebody is not understanding the problem, it's for all the reasons we talked about. They might have had competing priorities if they've been working on their careers and their education and their families and their political campaigns. They might not be spending as much time reading about this as everybody here on this call. So there is an element of, yes, we do need to explain to them. I joke and say everybody knows about climate change, but you're right, to different degrees, no pun intended. So yeah, being sensitive to somebody might not know how, and that's when, that's where being step-by-step narrative, and starting it with, this isn't on you. This, as you as an individual did not do this, but thankfully you're in a position to help. And so these, this is how we can connect it. And this is, so yes, I'm glad you brought that up. I start to sound a little cynical, and I literally am talking about, enough individuals in the planet that we could probably write them down on a list. I do not mean everybody who leans towards conservative politics by any stretch of the imagination. I mean I won't name anybody, but somebody who might own a really large influential social media platform. That is an individual who is
His name starts with D.
yeah, it could be a couple of them, but
One name.
but everybody who works for that organization, everybody who enjoys the social media platform, this is not on them. So when I talk cynically, I literally am talking about a handful of people. So you're right. I'm glad you brought us back from there, in that even when you're talking to somebody who has been voting on what we would consider the wrong side of this issue, the dangerous side of this issue, there is a good chance that they do need a little more explanation and understanding, and and careful communications to try and get them to, again, we might not bring them all the way to knowing everything about climate change, but if we can move them towards voting a different way on a policy that they might have voted this way for until you talk to them. Incremental change is important, even though we need to do it fast.
Okay, so I'd like to end with just one final question here, because I appreciate that we're sort of reaching the end of our time, and I think it's very relevant to what you're talking about, and I think that it can sort of center us back to something pragmatic for physicians something that, another sort of touch on a tangible tool that I know, we've spoke about today, but it's a question from Samuel in the audience. He asked if you have any tips on balancing an appeal to emotion when advocating for change while still acknowledging pain avoidance as a barrier to engagement.
So yes, this is a great question, because one thing I had to learn for myself is that the things that motivate people in the climate movement are not necessarily the same things that motivate the general public. So people who are prone towards advocacy and activism and pursuit of these solutions, we do respond to fearful emotions and big problems. We see a big problem, we get scared, we want to do a big solution. And most people, it's more natural to sort of close that off so you can go about your day and survive and not be paralyzed by anxiety. So appealing to emotion, one thing is, also when people have a more scientifically prone approach to their work, like in medicine, we tend to think of persuasion as sort of a dirty word a little bit, like, no, I want to give you the facts, you can make up your mind. So again, always remembering that somebody's persuading them somewhere, and you have their best interests at heart, and you know that you do. So when you talk to their emotions, I think, you can, give a sentence about how bad it is, but really focusing on, like I said, their personal agency in this solution. And if something is pushing them more towards anxiety, talking about different organizations they can join, small actions they can do that can make an outsized difference, especially, when they're with their family and friends, or making new friends in these organizations. So, because it's at least in the American Psychological Association, climate anxiety is not, and I'm not a medical professional, so putting that out there, I've just read this. The APA does not classify climate anxiety as a disorder because it's considered an appropriate response to the situation. It's not anxiety if you're being actively harmed and you feel scared. That's an appropriate reaction. So acknowledging that and giving people the tools and focusing on what they can do, and giving them permission to, if you have to close your mind or close your eyes to some of this, that's okay. Let's just focus on what you can do. And if it's overwhelming, call your mom, call your friend, really reach out, because this is a natural way to feel. We all feel it. And, here's a solution, because we all want to take care of each other and make sure that we're happy and healthy as possible.
Okay. Thank you so much, Patricia, for the answer and for the incredible presentation. I certainly learned a lot, and we've gotten already some great feedback from the audience. And also a huge thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. We always appreciate it. We will be posting the recording of this if you'd like to, watch it again or share with anyone who might not have been able to make it. It's going to go on our website, which I've just added to the chat here.